Ballooning debt, austerity measures, and national strikes. The entire global financial system is under threat. Conflicts of interest and difficult negotiations. Both the capital and labor sides need to make concessions to reach a better deal. Join us this weekend as Rachel Gong sits down with Juan Somavia, Director-General of the International Labor Organization. He warns of the increasing unemployment rate for the young generation worldwide and the ILO's dedication towards a harmonized relationship between capital and labor. Only on CCTV News. Two words stand out the most when it comes to European news headlines in 2011: austerity and strike. Even Christmas festivities in the New Year failed to soothe the angry workers. Holiday strikes to protest austerity measures paralyzed ground traffic in Belgium, delayed flights in Paris, and foreshadowed days of headaches for Christmas holidaymakers around Europe. Workers walked off the job to show their agitation at budget-slashing measures by their governments to tackle swelling debt and high deficits. On December 17, 2011, the Italian parliament passed the government's package of billions of euros in new taxes and pension reforms. Trade unions across the country went on strike 2 days later to protest austerity measures they say lean too heavily on the poor.
La piazza del lavoro pubblico, come quelle dei tanti presidi che abbiamo fatto in questi giorni, sono le piazze di coloro che sanno.
On December 1, 2011, Greece's labor unions also held a general strike. They protested the government's 2012 budget, which aimed to increase government revenue while cutting spending. The strike brought Greece to a standstill.
Όσο συνεχίζεται αυτή η πολιτική, η άδικη πολιτική, ο αγώνας και η προσπάθεια είναι η μοναδική διέξοδος για τους μισθωτούς και τους συνταξιούχους.
A one-day strike also took place across the UK on November 30, 2011, following the government's decision to raise the retirement age from 60 to 66 and to increase the proportion of pensions paid by individuals.
On average, we're looking at around £200 to £300 per month for people that they're going to be reduced in cost.
They object to the reforms that we are making to public sector pensions. But I believe those reforms are absolutely essential.
On November 25th, a large-scale strike broke out in Portugal. It was the largest general strike in the country for the past 2 decades. Protesters rallied against the government's 2012 austerity plan, which would cut salaries of public departments as well as medical and education expenditure. Debt crisis, austerity measures, and strikes. This vicious cycle has turned some protests into violent conflicts. Some analysts have pointed out most of the participants of these protests were young people. Data shows the unemployment rate for the young in the EU countries has increased to 20%. In some countries like Spain and Greece, that figure was as high as 50%.
Io mi sono laureato nel 2009 e mi sto specializzando, quindi diciamo che ho sempre lavorato, ho sempre cercato lavoro anche prima di laurearmi, insomma da laureando e anche adesso, per cui non ho mai smesso, diciamo.
Vedo molte cose che non ci stanno, non sono fattibili.
Some protesters argue slow economic growth and severe austerity measures have impacted on the ability of young Europeans to find jobs. The International Labor Organization has also warned of a lost generation of unemployed youth. Its Director-General Juan Somavia also reiterated that the unemployment of young people is the biggest headache for the world.
Mr. Somavia, it's a privilege having you with us.
Thank you so much. Very happy to be here.
How worried are you? If you take a look at Europe and read the statistics, it's astonishing. Countries like Spain, where unemployment rate is about 20%.
I think that it took everybody by surprise.
Workers going on strike throughout the world in times of...
I think that it goes beyond workers, you know. First of all, in the developed world, except for the Nordic countries and maybe Germany and a few others, there's a big disquiet there, you know. This is not... I mean, the families, when they sit around the table at night, people 50 and 60 years old, have the worry that their children are not going to have the chances that they had. So this feeling that maybe the next generation, instead of moving forward, is always the hope of one generation that are going to fall back.
Tomorrow will be better than today.
Well, in Europe, you're asking yourself, will that be so? So this is, it goes beyond the problem of a strike. It has to do with the identity of Europe, with, you know, what is happening to us, and how and when are we going to recover the capacity to grow and to be growing in a manner that gives everybody an opportunity and a chance. And of course, the ones that are most worried in all of this are the young people. In Spain is 45% unemployed. It's enormous. So when the medium in Europe is around 20% of...
The European debt crisis is also a crisis of perception of labor and work.
Of course, so you cannot just think that you get out of this crisis with austerity measures. Of course you have to deal with the issue of the debt, but at the same time you have to be able to ensure that you get private investment going, because in 2008 it was about stimulus packages. Countries do not have the same space today. So now growth is about promoting private investment, generating the, you know, the capacity to go through private investment. Investors in the real economy say, well, you know, it's a dicey situation, so how are we going to do it? Well, one of the things that can certainly be done is to concentrate on promoting small and medium enterprises, which are the ones that create most jobs. And if banks are not willing to lend, which would be understandable in crisis situation, but today it's about getting people jobs, not reducing the quantity of jobs because you're reducing the growth pattern.
While the Europeans protested their government's austerity policies, discontent also brewed in the U.S. The Occupy Wall Street movement began in New York's famed financial district. Protesters cast blame on the greed of Wall Street and the U.S. financial sector and the government's bailout of a small number of financial institutions at the cost of a large number of ordinary citizens.
The rich are getting richer while the poor are sitting down. The banks are taking it from them. Somebody's taking it from them.
In Europe, the debt crisis was causing a crisis in the banking sector. They too needed government assistance.
Das Finanzwesen steht im Zentrum und der Mensch kommt irgendwo dann als Gutes. Und wie gesagt, dass ich mich nicht vertreten fühle von einer Politik, die in allererster Linie wirtschaftlich handelt.
Some media commented that European governments on one hand frequently threw billions of euros to rescue the market, but on the other hand, were slashing spending despite the soaring unemployment rate.
The financial sector was supposed to be at the service of the real economy, yet they developed into a behemoth monster that took advantage of the real economy for a selected few interest groups. Isn't that so?
3 years ago, banks were begging governments to be saved from the financial crisis, and governments intervened, saved them. The financial system got better, the banks, you know, recovered their profitability, and they suddenly turned against the countries that had saved them, saying, now you pay the debt, and pay it quickly and rapidly, because, you know, if not, I'm going to, you know, change your rating. Why so rapidly? Why so quickly? Why so necessary? When countries were beginning to move out of the crisis, they needed a space to grow. They needed a space to be able to grow, receive the taxes, create the jobs that would create the conditions to pay the debt. So I think that there was a very strong mistake by the financial operators.
So you're saying the financial markets, the financial operators, should help the government.
Why produce suddenly the debt crisis, the fiscal consolidation process, and the need to tell Greece and the other countries that they should contract rapidly, which would of course reduce growth, and do it on the back of the people who had no responsibility whatsoever in the crisis.
The innocent laborers are paying for the mistakes made by financial operators and sometimes politicians.
Why Europe decided to save the banks without putting any conditions, that's a question mark that will be analyzed by history. But certainly that was the moment to ensure that in the future you would have a financial system at the service of the real economy, which will eventually happen.
Who are they that you're talking about?
The financial operators in the markets. It's, you know, they're there. We know they're there.
2011 was also a year of labor disputes, spanning from the world of sport to the world of aviation. The National Basketball Association's Christmas gift to fans this year is a full slate of marquee matchups. The season officially opened with 5 highly anticipated games. After 5 long months of labor struggles, NBA players are playing a new shorter season. According to the NBA's previous labor agreement, the income of players accounted for 57% of the association's total revenue. That was becoming unprofitable for many owners of NBA teams. They plan to reduce that proportion to 45%, cutting players' salaries by a total of $300 million. Negotiations began with players fighting for 52% versus the 50% bottom line offered. A lockout ensued, sending many NBA players to unlikely locations like China to play with local teams. After 23 rounds of negotiations, NBA Commissioner David Stern issued an ultimatum: accept the 50% or be faced with only 47%.
I'm not going to make, percentage guesses or anything like that. We'd like to, we want our players to play.
We've been given the ultimatum, and our answer is that's not acceptable to us.
On the 149th day of negotiations, the two sides reached an agreement for 50-50. With the cancellation of preseason games, players lost out on around $530 billion in salary payments. Owners of NBA teams lost $1.4 billion. On the other side of the world, another labor dispute was making headlines. Australia's flagship carrier Qantas was stuck between a rock and a hard place after a protracted period of industrial conflict with its staff. CEO Alan Joyce took the shocking decision to ground the entire Qantas fleet after the airline's employees threatened to go on strike.
We have decided to ground the Qantas international and domestic fleets immediately.
He claimed that he had no other choice.
The airline will die a slow death if we let this occur, so we had to take this dramatic action as a last resort.
Some media suggested Joyce's move was nothing short of putting a knife in Australia's neck. He bet the carrier's reputation on this gamble, causing a loss of 20 million Australian dollars per day to his company, and infuriated the Australian government.
With the rapid escalation of this dispute today, what we are seeing is a circumstance with this industrial dispute that could have implications for our national economy.
At last, after an intervention by Fair Work Australia, Qantas resumed flights after being grounded for 44 hours.
NBA games during which there was even the possibility of a suspension of the games of the season.
Now, your reference to NBA is very interesting because it's as if you knew that I had played basketball in my youth. No, I think that the issue is very simple. Sports has become a big business. And since it has become a big business, you have employees and workers negotiating. There's nothing odd about what is going on. When sports was amateur, you didn't have strikes and you didn't have lockouts. It becomes a big business. Of course, you have to divide the pie, and you may have differences of how to do it. So.
But does your organization sometimes intervene or choose to stay involved in some of those mediation process of strikes, like major strikes?
No, what we propose, and part of our identity is that we are tripartite, that we have employers, workers, and governments, in our structure. Our experience is the more you make that tripartism work, the more you produce social dialogue, the more you have collective bargaining, the more you get people to agree, even though they may have diverging interests in relation to how you distribute the pie, but not diverging interests in terms of stabilizing the economic situation, either of an enterprise, a sector, or a country. When you promote all of that, you have better conditions of stability towards the future.
The International Labor Organization was founded in 1919 in Washington. As a specialized agency of the United Nations, it deals with labor issues pertaining to international labor standards. Its tenet is to fully boost employment and labor management and cooperation. It's also dedicated to improving labor rights by way of legislation. The organization received a Nobel Peace Prize in 1960. In 1919, the ILO passed the Hours of Work Convention and the Minimum Age Convention, limiting the working day to 8 hours and making the minimum age requirement 14 years old. In 1944, the organization passed the Declaration of Philadelphia. The declaration focused on a series of key principles. In 1951, the ILO passed a convention calling for equal pay for equal work and advocated gender equality in the labor market for the first time. In 1999, ILO Director-General Juan Somavia stated for the first time that laborers should work decently. In 2009, faced with the prospect of a prolonged global economic downturn and increase in unemployment, the ILO adopted a Global Jobs Pact. It was designed to guide national and international policies aimed at stimulating economic recovery. It also called for the establishment of a global system to supervise financial institutions to serve the real economy. The broad policies of the ILO are set by the International Labor Conference, which meets once a year in June in Geneva, Switzerland. This annual conference brings together governments, workers, and employers delegates of the ILO member states.
My colleagues are very interested about the concept of decent work proposed by yourself and the International Labour Organization.
When you look at society and you ask, well, what are people hoping for? Well, one of the key things, maybe not the only one, but the key thing is to say, look, give me a fair chance at a decent job, and I'll do the rest, But give me the opportunity. So the decent work agenda is composed of employment creation, because you can't have decent work if you don't have work.
How attainable that goal is among the global picture of not so robust growth.
So part of the decent work agenda is the promotion of the productive investments in the real economy that are the ones that generate the enterprises that generate the jobs. So that's one part of the picture. The second is that you need jobs, but you also need social protection, and particularly if you don't have jobs. Now, each country has its own decent work challenge, and each country has its own decent work deficit. So you don't have a one-size-fits-all solution. I think that the policies of the ILO over there are good for the good times, and they're also good for the bad times. Because in the good times, people want decent work. In the bad times, they don't want to lose jobs.
In 2009, the Chinese worker was selected as the Person of the Year 2009 by Times Magazine. The magazine commented that Chinese workers are leading the global economic recovery. Chinese workers helped maintain the 8% annual growth rate of the Chinese economy in 2009. But a series of suicides at the Foxconn factory raised a pressing question. What of the well-being of Chinese migrant workers? Foxconn later raised salaries for its workers, in some instances by 100% at some factories. Local governments around China also raised the minimum wage by around 10%, but these measures failed to prevent the labor shortage in some major manufacturing provinces.
那么那个时候的农民工，他们的这个思考顺位是这个赚钱再来考虑到健康，再来考虑到家庭。80年后90年初的年轻的农民工，他们大部分都不是从事农民的工作，那只是户籍的问题。可是他们生活的这个优先顺序是有一个丰富的精神生活，然后再来健康，最后呢才是工作。
The new generation of migrant workers are looking to get higher pay and better benefits, but the rising salary standard is further squeezing the already thin profit margins of manufacturing companies. After many years of enjoying the Made in China label, many companies are finding it more and more expensive to produce in China.
The new generation of migrant workers are very different from their parents' generation. They expect a lot more from job itself and from life itself. So it seems to us that the entire China, particularly in the manufacturing world, people are trying to address and to cope with this new change in labor.
The fact that as development occurs and growth occurs, workers aspire to better conditions is a normal process. If costs go up or labor demands better wages, one has to understand that there was a long period of very low wages, so that this is a natural development. There is no developed country that has become developed because you have low wages. You develop because progressively you create better and better conditions, and finally you create a stable middle class, and you can then enter into a new value chain that permits you to continue to be competitive, but at another level of skills, of education, of technology. And China is beginning that process, so it's a perfectly natural process.
Even though for the past 30 years, China's economic miracle relies heavily on exports and on labor. But there are debates that whether we are losing the edge or the population dividend already.
Very dependent on exports, and you are slowly moving into creating an internal market, an internal demand. That requires a better relationship between productivity and salaries, and an increase in wages. And that balance is certainly necessary as a strategic option.
There are still a lot of talks on how China was deliberately trying to keep the wages and the salaries low to achieve advantage over trade, over exports.
Well, you know, let's not forget that in the 70s, beginning of the 80s, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank had one recommendation for developing countries. It said, grow first and distribute later. This was a general policy saying, look, keep wages down, concentrate on exports. The fact is that a country cannot develop on the basis of low wages and pure exports. It cannot continue with the levels of inequality that the growth model that we've had for the last 30 years has created, or the low level of job creation. So I think that China's policies are going very much in the right direction and are helping the world by doing what they're doing in China.
Compared with sought-after migrant workers, Chinese college graduates' employment prospects are not so optimistic.
那么从社会招聘来说，竞争非常激烈，所以企业会把很多的社会招聘的需求暂会延烧到校园里。
A new trend is that the earning power of rural migrant workers and college graduates is starting to converge. It's not uncommon that at job fairs, many graduates are striving for a position of office clerk with a monthly pay of just 1,500 yuan, while rural migrant workers are reluctant to take on jobs as a hotel porter with a monthly pay of 2,000 yuan. Although official data shows that nearly 90% of Chinese college graduates in 2011 are employed, many young people are still not satisfied. They are hoping to get a decent job with a high salary.
Every year we have millions of college graduates who are having difficulty locating jobs. And some say they should take on lesser options, such as being a waiter in a nice restaurant, or some other jobs that those college graduates themselves might find condescending. Would that be considered decent work or not so decent work?
No, it's not. The issue is not whether a particular work is decent for a particular person. So, no, it's the quality of work in general that you have in society. You cannot relate it one-to-one. I think that the problem of youth entering the labor market is a global problem. You know, when youth unemployment is 2 and 3 times the unemployment of adults, you can ask yourself, well, you know, adults are pretty smart. You know, they create policies that give them jobs but don't give us jobs, and that issue is not well solved. You still have a lot of university graduates that it doesn't fit with the offer that you have in the labor market. So you need more technical. You need a much varied structure that goes from secondary to very high level education, and the mix and the match with the offer. In China, you have had big growth, but you haven't had a commensurate level of job creation. You have to increase the intensity of jobs, the job intensity of growth.
What's your advice to the Chinese university graduates themselves, university graduates who can't find decent jobs in their own eyes?
look, you know, it's the answer that you or I would have, or whoever is listening to this program. You know, in life you have to take decisions, you know, and each one will take the decision that it feels most appropriate to that particular moment. The fact that you take a particular decision doesn't mean that you are condemned for life to that decision. But yes, decision making is part of growing up, you know, and inserting yourself in the real world. In the case of the ILO, we happen to be the institution that is listening to youth